do we do that?
Nothing. Should now be displayed. No, it doesn't see.
Hang on. Is Caroline Stott in the room? We have a technical problem.
No, it's here. No problem. It's done.
I see. Okay. Okay. Well, we'll get this underway. Welcome everyone to tonight's Energy Express seminar, which is being hosted jointly tonight by the Faculty of Engineering, Architecture and IT, and the Dow Centre and the UQ Energy Initiative. We're joined tonight by Mr. Rafael Cayuela, who's going to share his views on the grand challenges facing society and what it means to our engineering profession. So I think many in the room are engineers. We're very lucky to have him present here. He is the Corporate Chief Economist at the Dow Chemical Company, a global position. He is also a member of the Dow Global Corporate Strategy Team and a member of the International Government Relations or Government Affairs team. In this role, he translates what's happening in the world, the macroeconomic trends, the big moving issues that we face, and what they mean to Dow's strategy and how they're going to deal with regulators, governments, and international organisations. He holds a master's degree in European economics from the College of Europe in Brussels, has an executive MBA from the University of Chicago in the US, and he's also the author of this book, The Future of the Chemical Industry by 2050. He's an active international speaker on the chemical industry, bioeconomy, sustainability and climate change. He'll give us a presentation for about 40 minutes and then we'll open it up to Q&A, and after that we'll have networking drinks. And for those students who have made it to the event, Rafael has kindly donated 2 books which we're going to give to the 2 best student questions that get asked at the end. So keep in mind and concentrate and think up some questions. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rafael.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this afternoon presentation. And can you hear me well? Oh, is that good? Yeah? What about this one? Oh, let me see. So you see, I can forecast the future, but I cannot put the mic on. So we can actually not forecast the future either. Okay, what about that? Better? Yeah? Okay, good. So, as I said, first of all, thank you very much to the university for this kind invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here today with you. And actually, it's always a pleasure to be at the university where most of the ideas are coming from and where I think we can have a very great session. So I'm very looking forward to spend this hour with you and have some challenging questions at the end of the session. As Chris was saying, I'm going to talk about some of the major megatrends that they are going to impact our global economy. Not? Okay. Okay, now it's working. Okay, now it's working. Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so I apologize for that. Thank you again. Let me see. Now coming or not? Okay. Third time. Let's see now. Now it's good. Okay. As I said, thank you very much for the invitation. Today I would like to spend some time together to look at some of the major megatrends that are going to impact our global economy in the following decades. As Chris was saying, this is part of a research that is actually available on this book. A couple of copies are going to be available later on for the 2 best student questions, but also Wiley is the editor house for the book. Also will donate 2 books for the library, so you have some questions, comments later on, you can go there and pick it them. As we said, we are going to talk, whatever I'm going to say today is actually our comments coming from myself as an author, not really coming from the Dow Chemical Company. And what I would like to do in order to start the session is, today we are living in a very strategic times and very disruptive times. Actually, we might be living very historical times. And one of the problems we are facing today is that we are living in such a kind of rapid changing world that actually sometimes in the corporate world, but even perhaps at the university world, we don't have too much time to think. So when we try to make forecasts up to 2050, I thought that the best way to start thinking a little bit of what could happen moving forward is start thinking on what actually has been happening during the last 4 decades. So I have these questions to start a little bit the dialogue for this evening. The first question is, I would like to ask you, and you can take note yourselves, just reflecting a little bit on what we have accomplished as a society during the last 4 decades. So if I would ask you anyone, or you can take notes, or you can do the exercise mentally, but the first question would be, what do you think it was the world population in 1970? Currently it's around 7 billion people. The second question would be, what is the life expectancy today versus what it was in 1970? At this time, it's currently 65 years old. What is the world GDP? What was the world GDP in 1970? And also, what was the crude oil demand in 1970, so 40 years ago? Okay, so let me give you the answers. So during the last 4 decades, the population has doubled. Life expectancy has gone from 45 years to 65 years old. The world GDP, despite of the recent concerns about the status of the economy, has actually quadrupled as well. And when we look at crude oil demand, also doubled. Why do I put this at the beginning of the presentation? Well, I want to put that at the beginning of the presentation because I want to give us some perspective on what has been accomplished so far. So when we start looking into the future, some of the figures that you will see later on might create some concern, or you can be skeptical about some of them. But when you put things on perspective, you might realize that actually we have been accomplished a lot of things in society. It's only that today, in a world in which we are bombarded with data and we are actually going very fast, we tend to underestimate what has been accomplished. So keep in mind these kind of things and take my comment that probably we are living historical and very strategic times. So let me quickly go to some of the megatrends. I will fly to some of them, and then I will go to what is the potential impact for the chemical industry, eventually for engineering. The first one is the social megatrends. Well, I think this is something that, again, in a world that is constantly bombarded with data, is something that is not very new. So according to United Nations, by 2050, 4 decades from now, we are going to have a population between 9 to 10 billion people, depending on the scenarios. Well, again, this is something that everybody has been listening probably in the media, in the news, but if we go again to the perspective thing or strategic thing, we need to think what does it mean. And for instance, when I give this presentation, for instance, in India, and you think about the number of population that is going to have India, or the increasing population that is going to have India, India is going to add 440 million people. So basically, in the next 40 years, India is adding every single year 10 million people. Can you think about it? Every single year, 10 million people in India, currently. So you put it also in perspective, correct? Half of the Australian population is coming in India every single year. Amazing, correct? Another major megatrend is demographics and life expectancy. Again, according to United Nations, life expectancy is going to go up to 75 years from 65. To be honest, it can be a very conservative projection, because indeed, if we consider what has been accomplished so far, going 10 years up is not so much. Indeed, some of the schools of thought, like for instance, those coming from Silicon Valley, I will talk later on, they are talking about people living beyond 100 years by 2050, even going to 120 years by 2050. So this is one of the potential, one of the megatrends, but obviously another consequence of this megatrend is the number of people that is going to be above 65 years old is going to move from 8% of the global population to 16% of the global population, with obviously all the implications on financial systems and the pension systems in many economies. Another megatrend, social megatrend, is urbanization. So we are going to see the number of people living in cities moving from around 50% of the population is currently living in cities to up to 70%. If you go specifically into the different areas of the world economy, is the BRIC economies and the rest of the world or emerging economies, which are going to have the largest increase in terms of urbanization. In terms of the economy, let me also give you some high-level developments or expectations on this area. The first one is the global economy. This is data from PricewaterhouseCoopers. The global economy is expected also to quadruple over the next 4 decades. So we are going to go from $75 trillion to up to $280 trillion. What is also interesting is not only that the economy might multiply by 4, but it's actually the composition on growth. If you look at the last 4 decades, growth was fundamentally coming from developed economies. And for this research, what we have done is we have divided the world in 3 major areas: the advanced economies, Japan, Canada, United States, and Europe; the BRIC economies, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and the rest. This is obviously a big, large generalization, but it's just to frame the discussion, correct? Well, what we are going to see is the growth in the following decades has been gradually moving already in the last decade from the advanced economies to the emerging economies. This is going to continue being the case, despite of the last developments, for instance, in China, or the current developments in some of the emerging economies. That's why I think it's always important, correct, put things on perspective. Where is growth going to be massive is going to be still on the BRIC economies. The BRIC economies are expected to multiply themselves by 6 during the following 4 decades, while the emerging economies are going to multiply themselves by 4. So massive amount of economic growth. What also means this development is we are going to see a reshuffle in terms of what are the top 10 largest economies. If you look at the list of the top 10 largest economies, again, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, we are going to have China and India as the largest economies in the world, followed by United States and Europe. Couple of things on this chart. What we are going to see is that, first of all, 3 countries, China, India, and United States, might account for 50% of the global GDP, just 3 countries. The delta between the 4th largest economies and the rest is going to be enormous. It's going to be almost in the range of $20 trillion. So this is significantly, is actually very big. But also the composition of the top 10 economies might surprise you. Because if you see the top 10 economies today, it's very different versus the top 10 economies that they are going to be in the future. Among them, we will see countries that might be surprising to you, like Mexico, or Indonesia, or Turkey, or Nigeria. So we have to be prepared, correct, for major and also political changes and many changes associated to the growth on economic GDP. Okay, let me get closer to some of the challenges that we are going to be facing, correct, in the engineering world. And this is something that I know is very close to all of you and very well knowledgeable about that. So I normally have some slides about what it means climate change, but I will also look climate change from a kind of more economic perspective, not from a scientific perspective, as I am not a scientific person. What is climate change? Well, when I do this presentation to people, I said, well, there are scientific evidence that correlates greenhouse emissions with higher temperatures and eventually with climate change. What is important to remember here is that, as I said, I'm not a science, so I cannot discuss the science behind that, so I will look at climate change from an economical point of view. But I want to remember a couple of data points. The first data point is that there is existing correlation, correct, among CO2 emissions or greenhouse emissions and temperature. And what the global organizations are actually looking is the concentration of CO2 in terms of ppm. So they are looking at what they call the 2 degrees Celsius scenarios that most of you has been seeing in the media, and this is around 350 to 400, it's around 400 ppm of CO2. So if we go above this 400 ppm, we are going to be probably confronted with climate change, and this is the whole debate that we are seeing today, correct, in international organizations. When we talk about greenhouse gases, normally why do we talk about climate change with CO2 is because among the different greenhouse gases, CO2 is the largest component of greenhouse gases. They accounted for 72%. And if you look at where the efforts for reductions on greenhouse gases has been concentrated from governments, those has normally going into power stations, industrial processes, or transportation. So this is just to give you something that most of you probably already know. But what I wanted to do now is tackle climate change from an economical point of view. So what is climate change? Well, climate change is beyond a climate issue. It's a huge technological challenge. And let me spend some time on this chart. In this chart, what you can see is in the chart you can see with the red line, you can see the world GDP in 1970. And on red, you can see the CO2 emissions. So in 1970, what you can see is that the global economy was around $15 trillion, and the number of emissions, it was around 15 billion or 15 gigatons of CO2. So at that time, the correlation between one to another is basically, in order to generate 1 trillion of economic growth, the world was using 1 billion of CO2. So the correlation was kind of 1-to-1. When you enter into 2010, 40 years later, what we see is the economy multiplied by 4, but the CO2 emissions reduced by half, or multiplied only by 2. So actually, the world has become more efficient, correct? Well, what is the problem? The problem is that according to PricewaterhouseCoopers, the world GDP is expected to multiply by 4. That, by the way, is not a kind of a very aggressive number. If you look at economic growth from the 40 years previous, from 1940 to 1970, or eventually also the previous 40 years, economic growth globally has been around 6 times GDP, so 600%. So actually, 4 times multiplication is not such a kind of a big growth. It's kind of in the mean. So the problem is that if you have a GDP by 2050 of $282 trillion, and you assume the same level of efficiency as today, obviously that's a simplification, we will actually generate around 140 gigatons or billions of CO2. In my research at that time, this is 2013 data, I was thinking, well, obviously, we are going to have efficiencies, correct? And actually, if you look at international organizations, different organizations have different projections. But the number they are currently using is around 90 to 80 billion tons of CO2. What is the problem? The problem is that in order to avoid climate change and to remain within the 400 ppm of CO2 and to stay in the 2 degrees Celsius scenario, we need to live with 14 billions of CO2. In other words, we are going to triple the amount of people living in planet Earth versus 1970 from 3 to 9. We are going to multiply the global GDP by 20 from 15 to 300, but we need to live with the same level of energy efficiency, the same level of emissions as in 1970. And obviously, that is probably one of the largest challenges that we are going to be confronted in the following decades. So a 90% reduction or 80% reduction on CO2 emissions is a huge technological challenge. And often when I presented that, even including myself when I was reflecting about that, the problem I have with this is that why it's so difficult to tackle climate change? And even when you have people, when you talk to your family or your friends and you say, well, I believe it, I've been seeing all these people talking about that, I think it's actually true, there is certain correlation. I listened to this gentleman today at the university, he was telling me this, and actually it's true, but the question is, what do I do? And this is one of the major problems, correct? Is that you go to your wife, to your partner, and say, I want to help. What do I do? And the problem is that so far has been such a kind of complex topic, has been very difficult to go to the individual level to try to think what I can do. Well, I'm going to try to give you my point of view again on what does it mean for us. Well, it means that if you want to live with 14 billion, if we need to live with 14 billion of CO2 emissions by 2050, it means that we need to live with, and remember that number, 4,000 grams, or 4 kilos if you want, but 4,000 grams of CO2 per capita and day. And then you would say, okay, fine, Rafael, I can do the calculation. So basically you divided 14 billion tons of CO2 divided by 9 billion people, divided by 365, so very good. But still, what does it mean? Well, I'm going to give you another example. Why did I use 4,000 grams? When you take your car, a normal average car is generating around, what, 150, 200 grams, depending if it's Volkswagen, correct, recently, maybe higher, but assuming, let's say, for simplicity, 200 grams of CO2 per capita and day, sorry, per kilometer. So basically, if you are commuting to come to the university, most probably you have already depleted your allocation of CO2 emissions in 2050. Because if you go by 20 kilometers, you are already gone. So you cannot use your fridge, you cannot use your lights, you cannot use anything that we do. We cannot get the transportation from the food, correct? So going from 28,000 grams of CO2 per capita and day that is projected to be by 2050 to 4,000 grams per capita and day by 2050 under the sustainable scenario is not only a technological challenge, a massive technological challenge, or if you want, a massive technological opportunity. But as an economist, I have to tell you something else. In my eyes, this is the largest business opportunity in human history. Because if you get the gap between the 94 and the 14, so 80 billion tons of CO2, and here in Australia you have been having emission trading scheme, correct, for a couple of years, for 2 years. The average price of CO2 in Australia was around $23 to $24 per metric ton. So if you multiply $25 per metric ton for 80, what we are saying is that the gap between the emissions that we are going to have and the emissions that we need to have in order to avoid climate change is valued $200 trillion. And in my eyes, depending on the prices of your usage, I was using only $10 per CO2. This is, in my eyes, the biggest business opportunity in human history. But more importantly, companies, industries, and nations that they will not able to solve or to tackle climate change will disappear. And companies and industries or nations that are able to take advantage and look into the engineering possibilities to reduce CO2 emissions, they will be the leaders of the future. So this is my 2 words on climate change. I would also give you another dimension on the climate change from a political point of view. This chart is trying to give you my perception why the economic discussions, why the political discussions about climate change has been so difficult. And in my eyes, in this chart, basically what you get is that here in green you can see United States emissions already in grams per CO2. And what you can see is that in 2010, average citizen in the United States is living with around 54,000 grams of CO2. Well, the problem is that if you are sitting down in the US, it's very difficult, correct, to go and say, I'm going to reduce my emissions, because obviously we have been seeing that historically emissions is highly correlated with economic growth. So why should I reduce my economic growth, correct, in order to reduce CO2 emissions, when actually without doing anything, the United States was supposed to go from 54,000 grams to 43,000 grams. So it's already going to reduce, correct, the number of emissions. So why should I do anything? Actually, if I'm sitting down also in Europe, you could also say, well, I have 22,000 grams already. Without doing anything because of technological progress and effectiveness on manufacturing, I will probably go to 16,000. So at the time of the negotiations between different countries, obviously politically it's very challenging to take a decision when you're already reducing. And you also know that countries like India, that by the way, is already living today with 4,000 grams of CO2 per capita. So when you think about countries, when you try to put in your mind who is living today with 4,000 grams of CO2 per capita, just think in India. India is supposed to multiply their emissions from 4,000 grams to 50,000 grams because now they are going to enter in, correct, into the period of economic growth. So in that debate, it was also very difficult, correct, to get an agreement. The reality is that it doesn't really matter because every single country needs to go to the 4,000 grams if we want to reduce emissions. So climate change, huge technological challenge, huge political challenge, huge business opportunity. Okay, let me quickly go to energy. And energy, I think a couple of words on energy. The first thing is that energy transitions has been always happening. This is not the first, it's not going to be the last. The only thing to keep in mind on energy transitions is that energy transitions on historical basis never happened so far because the energy that it was in use was actually depleted. It just changed from one to another simply because the upcoming technology was more efficient, correct, and less costly. Another trend on important trend is actually price shocks are very important, correct? Price shocks are very indicative of transitions, correct? And this chart is basically showing you crude oil prices since 1860, since the beginning, to 2012. And what you can see here is that crude oil prices went from all the way from $1 per barrel in 1860 all the way up, correct, to the $120 or $140 in then 2012. But normally, what you can see with commodities as well as with energy is that anytime you have immaturity, the price of a commodity or energy, that is actually the same in maturity as at the time of inception in nominal terms, normally that has been a clear indicator that transitions are going to start to happening. Simply because it doesn't make sense if you think about it, correct, that after so many years you have the same price, correct, today that actually 150 years before. And to some extent, this is one of the reasons, correct, why we have been seeing the developments on shale gas in terms of increasing supply, but also why we have been seeing higher developments on energy efficiency because of the high price, correct? But if I go now to the business as usual scenario, this is data from the International Energy Agency. Under the business as usual scenario, energy is expected to triple during the last 4 decades. And of course, this data is changing all the time, but this is based on the fact of massive economic growth and enormous amount of population. But to some extent, this data is less important because we know that the business as usual scenario is not going to happen. We need to look at actually into the sustainable scenario. And the sustainable scenario is basically how are we going to be able to live with 4,000 grams of CO2 per capita a day. And obviously, that is a much more challenging scenario, correct? So here, I'm going to give you a web page that I will recommend you to visit. It's called My 2050. It's from the government, the British government. You can see there. And what they have been trying to do is that the British government has been trying to look what kind of energy changes do I need to have in order to have England, this particular country, to live with 4,000 grams of CO2 per capita a day. And I encourage everybody to play around with this because it's a kind of simulation, so you can play with all these different levers, correct, and you can adjust supply, you can adjust demand. But I give you a quick snapshot of what they are saying. Well, what they are suggesting for England is basically, and by the way, it's very similar at the global level, is that natural gas has to increase by 34% by 2050. Nuclear, biomass, renewables will go up, but also crude oil has to be reduced by almost 30%, as well as coal. But then we will need to have massive improvements in carbon capture storage, and we will need to have almost 60 to 80% of electrical cars. So I think great times to be in engineering, because I think, as far as I know, all these projects is talking about engineering things, correct, that need to happen in the following decades. Massive changes, correct? Okay, now let me give you the last of the major megatrends. I don't know how many of you are familiar with singularity, but this is certainly one of the most exciting things. Because basically what I'm going to tell you now is that everything I told you is still under sustainable scenario that, by the way, is already quite challenging, correct, as we saw, having 80% reductions. Everything I told you is going to get even 5 times, 10 times, 20 times more complex than that. Because singularity is basically saying the following. Singularity is basically saying computational progress and technological convergence is going to accelerate human progress in a massive way. What the Singularity University is saying is the following. by 2025, the computational capacity of one computer would be the same as one person. And we have been seeing, correct, the developments on telephones and all kind of devices, correct? So we see the computational program acceleration. But they also said by 2045, the computational capacity of one computer would be equivalent to the whole mankind. And obviously, the convergence of IT and computational capacity with other science disciplines is going to get acceleration in any single field. And this is why when you apply singularity to every single industry, you see exponential growth in ways that we never seen before. But then you can tell me, okay, I understand a little bit the computational capacity, Rafael, is improving, but can you give me an example? How is that going to work? Well, let me give you an example. How is it going to work under singularity? Let me give you the comments about exponential growth. According to singularity, any industry, when get digitalized or exposed to computational increases on computational capacity, goes through different phases. These phases has been characterized under the 6D. And these phases, you can think now in a couple of industries that has been going through already to this process, like for instance, the newspaper industry, or for instance, the music industry. So the first thing that happens is that one day you have a CD or DVD, or we have a book. But then some person correctly start applying digitalization on that industry. By the way, we are going to see something similar in the automotive industry. After we start digitalizing that industry, the first thing that happens is that the incumbent players on that particular industry, they become deceptive. So you are an industry, correct? You are the Wall Street Journal, or you are actually Sony selling music. The first thing that happened to you is you said, well, all these guys selling digital things doesn't make any sense. This is my industry. So you become deceptive. And that lasts a long period of time. It can last 5 years, 10 years, correct? And you are like, I don't believe this is going to happen. But then one day, this becomes disruptive. And then when that happens, a couple of things happen. The first thing is that you dematerialize that industry. You don't have any more, correct, CDs, DVDs. You have it, but very little, correct? We have, all of us, we have MP3s or iTunes or digital devices, correct? But also what happens is that you demonetize that particular industry. You extract all the cash from that. The margins go down, but also what you also get is you democratize that industry. So a service, a newspaper, it was something correct. It was not available for everybody. Now information is ubiquitous. These 6 steps, basically what they do is that for any particular industry, we are going to have an acceleration on growth that is unpredictable. It's actually going to levels that you cannot really see how they are going to unfold. But certainly it's going to accelerate most of the dynamics on any industry. And this is why this is a very singularity. I didn't apply singularity to my research because obviously already the sustainable scenario is very complex. But singularity is just I wanted to put it here because I want you to think that on top of the sustainability revolution, the digital revolution, the convergence of the sustainable revolution with the digital revolution is most probably going to drive the next industrial revolution. So what is the impact for the chemical industry? And here, some of them are based on the business as usual scenario. The first conclusion is that obviously the chemical industry is going to be growing under the business as usual scenario. As a first thing we are going to see is that today China is already the largest chemical market in the world. By 2050, China and India will become the largest chemical markets in the world. Of course, India is going to be the fastest growing chemical market in the following decades, both in pharmaceuticals as in basic chemicals, and then every single market is going to go for massive growth. But actually, India and China, the BRICS, are going to be the ones driving the demand side, correct? From a feedstocks perspective, we are going to see the move from traditional fossil fuels feedstocks to more lighter feedstocks, not necessarily going yet by 2050 to full renewables. I think it will be a still big chunk of the petrochemical industry will still be based on fossil fuels. But what we will see is that we will be moving from liquids, we will be moving to gases. And why? Because if you look at, for instance, the level of CO2 emissions on the petrochemical industry when you apply when you actually use liquids versus gases, already going from naphtha to ethane is around 25 to 30% emissions reductions. And remember, when we start applying the 4,000 grams perspective to any industry, it's going to be clear movements, correct, to reduce emissions. So we will see still the petrochemical industry based in fossil fuels with developments on biofuels, but certainly we will go from lighter feedstocks. Another important remark on things that are going to happen is the chemical industry is an enabler, a clear enabler of CO2 emissions. Indeed, in 2005, 2007, I think, the level of emissions that the chemical industry generated is around 3 billion tons. So it's around 10% of the total emissions, correct? But the chemical industry is enabling the reductions of CO2 emission in the range of 6 to 7. So it's a critical industry to fight climate change, because even though it's using even though it's using CO2, it's going to help massively to reduce CO2 emissions. Another consequence for the chemical industry is that under the new perspective of the 4,000 grams, we are going to continue to see in emission trading schemes and more stringent regulation. And now in the following months, actually, we see the discussions under the COP21, correct, in Paris, and what we are going to see, and we are already seeing, is that many largest economies are already fixing targets, correct, for emission reductions. Because United States recently, China, India, and many others will follow. And this is something that is not gonna be stoppable, correct, in the following years. What is also important is that what we have been seeing is what is the impact of having a price, correct, on CO2. And here is a chart coming from The Economist, in which you can see some of the prices that some of the large companies are actually using internally for CO2. And for instance, ExxonMobil, as the largest CO2 emitter in the world, is around 300 million tons of CO2. They are calculating an internal carbon price of $60 per metric ton. But if you think about it, what does it mean is that ExxonMobil, I think in 2013, their EBITDA was around $35 billion. If you take actually this price of $60, what ExxonMobil is contemplating is that in a couple of years from now, whenever we have carbon prices, correct, implemented in the global economy, they will need to pay around $8 billion. Of course, if you make, in 2013, they were making around $30 billion EBITDA. But that was when crude oil prices, they were around $100. With crude oil prices around $50, they are probably making around 15. But if you are having $15 billion EBITDA and you need to pay $8 billion, well, that's significant impact, correct, into your balance sheet. So what we are going to see is that most of these large companies, they are going to be, actually, when we have a high carbon price, they are going to be struggling to not only in an environment, in a global environment in which emissions are becoming more important, they are going to be actually financially entering into a very difficult period, correct, because they are going to see substantial, significant reductions, correct, into their EBITDA. Okay, let me just go to one of the last slides in my presentation that I think is probably the most pertinent to you, and this is my personal view on what else is going to happen moving forward in terms of innovation. When we look at from 1850, going all the way back, and we look at what has been the innovation shape, what we can see is that if you go to the 1860s, the chemical industry specifically, but I think we can go to any kind of science or any kind of engineering science, what we have been seeing is that at the beginning of the 19th century, and for the first half of the 19th century, the chemical industry has been fundamentally solving problems, and has been solving mankind problems. So when we were contemplating the possibility to grow the population, I mean, you can see there on the bottom, in 1850, the global population was 1.2 billion people. 1.2 billion people. At that time, one of the most famous economists at that time, Malthus, was scaring everybody, saying, we cannot live in this planet because we are going to have population double. And at that time, we were at 1.2 billion people, correct? We went to 1900, 1.7, 1950, 2.5 million people. And then what happened is that the chemical industry has been called to solve some of these problems. So what happened is that when we are confronted with population issues or lack of food, fertilizers from the chemical industry, they were invented. When we were contemplating, when we had the first industrial revolution, and we were confronted with textile issues, and we wanted to get correct textile, and we wanted to get colors, we created dyeing chemicals, correct? And then with that, we have companies like BASF, then we have chlorine issues, then we invented bleach. So basically what I'm trying to say is the chemical industry has been gradually, over the years, over the decades, has been always solving mankind problems. And with that, innovation has been, the whole chemical industry as we know it today, big chunk of the chemical industry was actually developed and invented in the first half of the 19th century. But what happened is that after 1950, you look at the innovation path, innovation has been coming down. And the question is why that has been happening. Well, I think that has been happening is because the chemical industry was actually solving another problem. And the problem wasn't innovation requirements, has been solving the problem of massive economic growth. If you look at the period from 1970 to 2010, this is the longest period of peace in recent history. And it's probably the longest period of both population growth and economic growth. And if you look at even specifically the last 10 years with the insertion of China into the global economy, we have been exposed to massive economic growth, correct, and massive creation of wealth. In this environment, what happened is that innovation has been coming down, but at the same time, operational efficiencies has become the most important thing for the chemical industry. So the industry has been focusing on doing more, better, more efficient. Indeed, a study from McKinsey has been studying chemical industry for the last 10 years. They found out that only 25% of innovation in the chemical industry is actually new chemistry. 75% is incremental innovation or operational efficiencies. What do I think is going to happen now? Because of the sustainable revolution and because the digitalization of the global economy, the convergence of these two things are going to enable probably what I think is going to be the developments of the third industrial revolution or the next industrial revolution. And the next industrial revolution or the sustainable revolution or the 4,000 grams per capita, what it's going to do is basically we are going to have a period of massive innovation coming in the following decades. It's going to be on the chemical industry. We are going to see things like bioeconomy, biorefineries, but also nanotechnology, circular economy, and singularity playing a major role. What we are going to see as well is that we are going to see a technological convergence. We are going to see many science coming together, especially as we digitalize these industries. And what we are going to see is that because of the nature of the challenges are so complex, what we are going to see is a merge of business collaboration. We are going to see many businesses coming together because tackling 90% reductions of emissions is such a kind of complex issue that you need to put many companies together. So with all that in mind, I think what we are going to see is in the following decades is very exciting times to be in engineering because this technological convergence and business collaboration and these two challenges, sustainability and digitalization, are going to create a massive need again for engineering. Of course, operational efficiencies are going to be down versus before, but this is just what is expected. So with all that in mind, what are the conclusions? I think the conclusions is that the world is poised to witness another long period of transformation. We are actually living strategic times and historical times. In a world with 9 billion people and an economy of 283 trillions, the world has the potential, again the potential, to have the largest, wealthiest, wisest, and healthiest society in human history. China and India are expected to become the largest economies in the world, United States as well, and we will see that they will have already the largest chemical markets. Life expectancy is expected to go to 75 years, but singularity can accelerate that to maybe 100, 130 years. During this transition, GDP is going to triple from $10,000 to $30,000, and singularity will accelerate is going to accelerate any of these changes that we have been talking before. However, our world will not be sustainable. And living with 4,000 grams per capita a day is, as I said before, a big challenge, correct? So we will see governments around the world will keep enacting more and more stringent regulations. Emission reductions and resource scarcity could trigger the next industrial revolution, the sustainable one. This industry, and I would even extend it to engineering, is going to be called into action. We are going to see more and more demand for solutions, correct? New companies will be appearing, the Teslas of the world. All companies might be disappearing, but with companies, industry competitiveness is going to be reshuffled. And I think addressing emissions and energy reductions is not only a huge technological challenge, a moral obligation to future generations, but also is an enormous business opportunity. So don't keep that in mind. I think this is an historical opportunity, again, for the chemical industry to shine in what it has been always doing better. It's not operational efficiencies. It's technology and innovation. So with all that in mind, I think the chemical industry, to be extended to engineering, is going to be, again, at the core of the next industrial revolution. I only hope that this time we don't forget it very soon, because in the chemical industry the last 40 years we have been growing and growing, but we forgot the roots of the industry, and those that were based on innovation and technology. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rafael. So we have a couple of roving microphones, and so we'd like to invite questions from the audience. And remember, there's a prize for the best student questions. First question doesn't look like it's coming from a student, but less hair than me.
Well, that's an excellent question indeed. I didn't discount it. We have under the research what we call the worst scenario, or kind of worst case scenarios, and obviously you have geopolitical instability as one of the major concerns. I mean, energy shifts historically has been creating wars in the past. And I think what we are actually seeing these years already with the collapse of crude oil prices is this is destabilizing already the economic system. So indeed, this is something could actually happen if not properly handled, if this transition is not properly handled. Absolutely. Great question.
There's a question, fellow in the pink shirt. Keep your hand up.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is, it has a potential like a market, do you think we could face in a potential like war for carbon dioxide? You know, the countries that have the highest emission trying to recover the carbon dioxide for new products,
Mm-hmm.
and then who owns the carbon dioxide? Something like what happened with
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. No, great question, I think. I think maybe I gave you the impression perhaps that indeed there is a kind of solution already in the table. I think not at all. I mean, this is a very complex and challenging topic. So basically addressing supply issues, demand issues, addressing also the potential of carbon capture storage units, or using actually CO2 as a potential feedstock is something that actually can be used. I think every single idea that helps to reduce CO2 emissions is going to be considered. Indeed, in Europe today, there is great interest on the European Commission is working on different papers on how to start utilizing CO2 as a feedstock for the future on the chemical industry. So I think yes, all these scenarios are something that we have to explore, and they will be explored, absolutely, including the one that you mentioned. Mm-hmm.
And just in front. Stand up and speak loud. So the question is, what are the incentives that would encourage the economy to reduce emissions?
Well, that's a fascinating question, great question indeed. I mean, I was reflecting, we were talking this morning about this, and India, as you saw in my chart, is currently living with 4,000 grams of CO2 per capita in day. And anyone has been going into India, probably you have a feeling, correct, on how is living in India with 4,000 grams of CO2 per capita a day. As I said before, some scientists, people normally some people still today question if there is a correlation between CO2 emissions and climate change, okay? But there is one thing that is clear. There is a correlation between CO2 emissions and economic growth. So as you rightfully pointed out, of course, why countries like India should actually do something like that. Well, a couple of days ago, India announced a draft for the COP21 in which they are talking about reducing their emissions by 25%, around 25%, 30% by 2025, 2030. And of course, my first reaction as yours was, wow, that's very brave, correct? Because considering a country that is going to still have massive economic growth, still have GDP per capita at a level very, very low, correct? And they are actually going to have, again, if you put 10 years from now, another 100 million people entering into that economy, achieving 25%, 30% of CO2 emissions is certainly a very challenging scenario, correct? Why are they doing that? Why China is doing that? Why India is doing that? Well, I think two things. One is because if you go to some of these countries, the first thing that you notice is that living at this level of emissions is certainly unbearable. It's not humanly sustainable. When you go into Beijing, correct, and you see this huge smoke, correct, in the city, and you go to Mumbai and you see similar things, what is actually happening is that people says, well, this is not bearable, it's not sustainable. And this is something very different, correct, because when CO2 emissions or large pollution concentrations in history has been happening, when the first industrial revolution happened in Britain, correct, in the 1700s, if you have a smoke on the city, what happened? Not much, correct, because you are in the 1700s. But in the 2015, you see in internet, correct, what is quality of life. So you cannot afford anymore to live with these standards. So the first answer to your question is societal concerns. I mean, society is not able to live anymore with these pollution levels, correct? The second question is, obviously, you can take the opportunity to leapfrog economic growth. So when you go into Africa, correct, we have been seeing, for instance, on the telecommunication industry, that we don't need to have massive infrastructure anymore for the telecommunication industry. They went to mobile phones. So for countries like India or China, this is a great opportunity to upgrade their countries in a very short period of time. Of course, India, for instance, in this example, is actually requesting, and it's going to be a massive economic stimulus or economic challenge. They are going to request around $3 trillion to upgrade their economy. So I think my interpretation to the answer to your question is society at this time want to live in a better quality of life, and secondly, this is a great opportunity even for emerging economies to upgrade their economies to the future. Hopefully I answered your question. Mm-hmm.
So you'll have to stand and...
Will countries, following on from last one, will countries continue to set their own targets and their own incentives to reach those targets, or will there be global collective?
Yeah, I think, well, this is what is currently on discussion today under the COP21 in Paris that is coming now at the end of November or beginning of December. And yes, I think that's the major discussion, correct? Are there going to be an alignment in goals? I think at the country level, every country can decide to what strategy you want to use, correct? But it seems to me that most of the major economies are already going to go into that direction. I think of the G20, only Saudi Arabia is the only country has not been sending their proposals for emissions reductions for obvious reasons, but most of the other economies are going to go into that direction. Different countries will go at different levels, correct? But it will be a kind of consensus on moving forward. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The change required to cut emissions down to the 4,000 grams per capita is pretty drastic. Do you think that's actually going to be possible from what you've seen in the industry so far?
Yeah, you have a lot of expertise here in the room, correct? Some people will tell you, no, it's not possible. I'm an optimistic person. I believe in mankind. I believe on different alternatives. I think it's possible. I think it will happen. It's not going to be easy, but I think the fundamental problem we have been having on tackling climate change in the last 10 years, if you saw in my 2 slides, is that, first of all, scientifically has been a very difficult problem, correct? It has not been agreement, and still, in some people, don't believe on it, correct? The second problem was, even when the science has been in agreement, politically it has been very difficult, correct, to take an action, because there are obvious economic consequences. But history proves that when you have consensus on governments putting a problem, a clear, defined problem, to the world, engineering world, or the companies or industries, that problem has been solved. And if you look at history, when we look at, for instance, the developments on some of the chemical products, one that is very close to my heart, synthetic rubber, for instance, and this is why it's so fascinating, the chemical industry, correct? When United